The palace breathed before the world woke up. That was the only way Maren Ashveil had ever been able to describe it. This particular quality of stillness that lived inside the stone walls of Caelum Palace in the hour before dawn. When the torch sconces had burned low, and the guards had not yet changed their shift, and the great corridors belonged, briefly, entirely to her. She pressed her palms flat against the eastern wall and closed her eyes. The stone was cool beneath her hands, then warm, then something that had no name in any language she had ever been taught, a hum that lived below sound, a conversation that lived below words. She felt the weight of the floors above pressing down through centuries of granite. She felt the old fault line beneath the foundation, slow and patient and restless in the way that only stone can be restless, not urgently but inevitably. She fed it what it needed: warmth, pressure redistribution. The quiet insistence of her own heartbeat offered like a gift. Then the paper hit her chest. She caught it by reflex. Read it once, the words flat and official and final. Expulsion, effective immediately, by order of the king. Maren folded the notice in half. She turned back to the wall. She pressed both palms flat one last time, held them there for 10 long breaths, and felt the stone shudder, just slightly, as if it understood. Then she picked up her bag and walked out into the pale, indifferent morning. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. She had not always been invisible. There was a time, brief, early, before she understood the rules, when Maren had believed that being useful was the same as being seen. She was wrong about that. It took her approximately 3 weeks inside Caelum Palace to understand her error, and approximately 3 years to stop hoping she might somehow be the exception. The palace was enormous in the way that power always makes itself enormous, not because it needed to be, but because it could be. 4 wings, 11 main corridors, 2 grand staircases that swept upward like frozen waves, and more rooms than any reasonable household required. Maren had learned every inch of it not by map, but by hand, by touch, by the slow accumulation of mornings spent moving through its silence before anyone else was awake. Her palms finding the places where the stone held tension. Her gift doing quietly what it had always done, listening, responding, healing. Her official role was palace maintenance, 3rd tier, which meant she carried cleaning equipment, reported to a supervisor who never learned her last name, and was assigned sleeping quarters in the Eastern Service block alongside 12 other Omegas and 4 Betas who worked the grounds. Her uniform was gray. Her meals were taken in the service hall. Her days began at 4 in the morning and ended whenever the work was done, which was usually well past dark. None of this bothered her, precisely. She had grown up in conditions far less comfortable. What she had not fully prepared for was the specific quality of invisibility that came with her position. Not poverty, not cruelty, but erasure. The way the palace courtiers would walk past her in a corridor, without their eyes registering her presence at all. The way a lord might stop directly beside her to discuss something private and sensitive, apparently having calculated that she did not qualify as an audience. The way the guards on the night rotation had developed the habit of walking around her mop bucket rather than asking her to move it, because asking would have required acknowledging that she existed. She learned to make herself small. She learned to move along the edges of rooms. She learned the specific pace that said I belong here without saying I matter here. She learned to keep her eyes down not from shame but from strategy, because an Omega who met an Alpha's gaze in this palace was an Omega who invited attention. And attention, in her experience, had never led anywhere good. And yet, in the private architecture of her own mind, Maren was not small at all. When her palms touched the palace stone, she was the largest thing in any room she stood in. She could feel the entire building the way a musician feels a symphony, as a living system of tension and release, pressure and breath. She knew which archway in the north corridor had been carrying too much weight since the decorative keystone was replaced with a heavier one 2 winters ago. She knew that the foundation pillar nearest the king's private study had a hairline fracture running diagonally through its base that no structural engineer had ever spotted, because no structural engineer had ever thought to press their hands flat against it and simply listen. She knew that the east wing's alignment had been shifting, slowly, patiently, dangerously, since the underground tremor 4 years ago that had been dismissed by the palace's official record as negligible. She managed all of it, Silently. Daily. Without instruction, without recognition, and without complaint. The other maintenance workers were kind enough, in the peripheral way of people who shared difficult conditions and have agreed, without speaking, to make those conditions survivable. Petra, who worked the kitchens, would sometimes savor a portion of the better bread. Old Gareth, who managed the groundskeeping equipment, had once, without comment, moved her supply cart out of a corridor where she would have been directly in the path of a high-ranking inspection tour. Small kindnesses. The currency of the invisible. What none of them knew, what no one in the palace knew, was the weight she carried every single morning. Not the weight of her work, the weight of what she knew. The fault line beneath the Eastern Foundation was not dormant. It was not ancient history. It was active, patient, and waiting. And she was the only living person who understood this, because she was the only living person who had thought to ask the stone. She had thought, many times, about telling someone. About walking to the palace steward's office and saying, very clearly, there is an active geological instability beneath the East Wing, and without sustained intervention, we are looking at critical structural failure within 18 months of cessation of maintenance. Every time, she had swallowed the thought back down. Because the last time she had told the truth about what she felt in stone, she had been 9 years old, and the adults had laughed. On the morning of her 300th consecutive day at the palace, she had counted. She always counted. She pressed her palms to the south corridor wall and felt something new. A vibration, deeper than the usual conversation of stone. Something shifting far below, with an urgency it had not carried before. She filed it away in her maintenance log that night, in her careful small handwriting, and told no one. The east corridor was the oldest part of the palace. You could feel it in the stone itself, a different density than the newer wings. A different temperature, a different quality of silence. The builders who had laid this foundation 3 centuries ago had worked with granite quarried from the mountain range visible on clear days from the palace's upper windows. And that granite had a particular personality, patient, proud, and deeply profoundly communicative to anyone with the sensitivity to receive what it was saying. Maren arrived at the east corridor at 4:47 in the morning, 17 minutes earlier than usual, because the vibration she had felt the night before in the south wall had followed her into her sleep, and she had woken with a specific internal urgency that meant something needed attention now. She set down her maintenance cart, a prop, really, for anyone who might pass by and need an explanation for her presence, and pressed both palms flat against the wall at the point where she had first felt the fault line's restlessness 3 years ago. The stone spoke immediately. That was the only word for it, though she knew how it sounded. It was not language. It was not even sound, exactly. It was information delivered through a medium that had no name in any scientific framework she had ever encountered, a resonance that moved up through her palms and into her wrists, and along the bones of her forearms, until it reached the place in her chest where she held her breath when she was concentrating, and there it translated itself into something she could understand. Pressure map, weight distribution, fracture geography. She felt the east corridor's stress points the way a blind person reads a page, by touch, by texture, by the specific language of variation. The main wall here was carrying approximately 12% more load than it should have been. Since the upper floor renovation 2 summers ago added weight, without accounting for the foundation's age. The granite was not failing, but it was tired. It had been asking for help for 18 months, and she had been answering. She began. The process was not dramatic. It was not visible. She simply stood with her palms flat against cold stone in the gray pre-dawn light and breathed with a specific intention, a long exhale that she had never been able to explain properly, but that felt. From the inside, like offering herself as a conductor, her body produced something, a low-frequency resonance. Perhaps she had once read a fragment of an old text that described her ability in those terms, though the text itself had been catalogued as folklore. Whatever it was, the stone received it. She felt the tension in the wall shift, redistribute, ease, like watching a held breath release. She worked her way along the corridor methodically, pausing at each stress point. At the third pillar from the eastern entrance, she stopped longer than usual. The diagonal fracture in its base, the one no engineer had ever found, had grown since her last visit. Not dramatically, but measurably. She pressed both hands low against the pillar's base, crouched close to the floor, and spent 20 minutes in focused conversation with the damaged stone. When she finally stood, her knees ached and her palms were faintly red from the sustained contact, but the fracture had stabilized. She was moving to the fourth pillar when she heard footsteps. Not the soft, careful steps of a guard on a night rotation who had learned to move around her. These were deliberate, purposeful, the steps of someone who wanted to be heard. Lord Aldrich Fenwick was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered in the way that suggested he had been athletic once, and now carried the memory of it rather than the reality. He wore the deep blue of a newly appointed palace advisor, his rank insignia polished to a brightness that spoke of recent installation. He had arrived at the palace 6 days ago as head of the king's new structural modernization initiative, which Maren knew because the entire maintenance staff had been required to attend a briefing about cooperating with his inspection tours. He stopped at the entrance to the east corridor and looked at her. She straightened, lowered her hands, waited. His expression moved through several stages: confusion, assessment, and then something that settled into a particular kind of contempt that she recognized immediately. The contempt of a man who has decided what something is before he has looked at it properly. "What," he said slowly, "are you doing?" "Maintenance, my lord." "You were pressing your hands against the wall." "Yes, my lord." "For what purpose?" The question was not genuinely curious. It was the shape of a trap, and she knew the shape well enough to know she could not answer honestly without stepping directly into it. "Checking for surface temperature variations," she said. "It helps identify moisture penetration in older stone." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. And the quality of his silence told her everything. That evening, in his report to the King's Advisory Office, Lord Fenwick described the incident in 3 sentences. Omega maintenance worker observed performing apparent ritualistic behavior in the east corridor, pressing hands against walls, eyes closed, unresponsive to standard inquiry. Behavior is eccentric, unprofessional, and inconsistent with palace standards. Recommend immediate review of maintenance staff assignments. Maren did not see the report, but somewhere in the palace's upper offices, a document began to take shape, and the stone beneath her feet, patient and ancient and afraid, had no way to warn her. The village of Ashveil was small enough that everyone knew the shape of everyone else's grief. Maren had grown up in its single main street, in a house with a gray door and a garden that her mother kept with the focused attention of someone who needed one thing in her life to be entirely under her control. It was a quiet village, careful, the kind of place where deviation from the expected was not punished loudly but managed, gently, persistently, collectively, until it disappeared. Maren had been 9 years old the first time her gift announced itself. She remembered it with the specific clarity that the mind reserves for its most formative wounds. Not the full scene, but the sensory details that surrounded it. The smell of chalk dust, the weight of her school bag on her left shoulder, the way the morning light came through the schoolhouse's eastern window at an angle that turned the dust motes golden. She had been sitting at her desk when she felt it, a deep, groaning wrongness in the wall to her right. Not heard, felt, in her palms, which had been resting flat on the wooden desktop, conducting the vibration up through the desk's legs from the floor beneath. The wall was speaking in the language she had not yet learned she was fluent in, and what it was saying was urgent and clear. She had stood up, walked to the wall, pressed both palms flat against it the way she would, years later, press them against palace granite, with the focused attention of someone listening for something vital. The schoolmistress had asked her to sit down. She had said, very clearly, in the carrying voice of a child who does not yet know that truth requires strategic delivery, "The wall is going to fall. There is something wrong underneath it. We need to leave." The room had gone quiet in a particular way, the quiet of collective adult embarrassment on behalf of a child. The schoolmistress had said with careful patience, "Maren, sit down." "But I can feel it." "Sit down." She had sat. The school day had continued, and for 3 days nothing happened, and Maren had begun the uncomfortable process of learning to doubt what she knew in her bones to be true. On the 4th day, the eastern wall of the schoolhouse collapsed. No one was inside. It happened at night, a mercy she had not fully appreciated until she was much older and understood what might have been. The structure had been built on a section of ground with poor drainage, and a week of rain had finally undone what decades of gradual erosion had been working toward. Entirely predictable in retrospect to anyone who had thought to ask the stone. But the village did not respond with wonder, or with gratitude, or with the careful, curious attention that might have changed the entire trajectory of her life. They responded with fear. Not the loud, dramatic fear of a mob. This was Ashveil, where everything was managed quietly. It was a series of conversations she was not present for, evidenced by their outcomes. The way neighbors stopped allowing their children to play at her house. The way her mother's expression changed when she came home from the market. The way the schoolmistress began seating her at the back of the room, away from the walls. Someone used the word unnatural within her hearing. Someone else used the phrase bad omen. Her father, a gentle man who loved her and did not know how to protect her from something he could not see or name, sat her down one evening and said, "You must not do that again. The thing with the walls. You must not tell people what you feel. Do you understand me?" She had understood him. She had understood him so completely that the understanding had become architecture, load-bearing walls inside her own mind, invisible and essential, holding the shape of a self that had learned to live entirely in its interior. She had spent the next 14 years becoming very, very good at silence. Now, standing at the palace gate with her single bag and her expulsion notice folded in her pocket, Maren understood that she had carried that 9-year-old girl with her every single morning into those pre-dawn corridors. Every time she had swallowed the truth about the fault line. Every time she had written her findings in a maintenance log she knew no one would read. Every time she had called her gift temperature assessment rather than what it actually was. She had been protecting herself. She had been protecting the village child who had learned that being right was the most dangerous thing she could be. She pressed her palm to the gate's stone post as she passed through it. The stone shuddered, just slightly, just enough for her to feel it, and for one unguarded moment, she pressed her forehead against it too. Then she straightened, picked up her bag, and walked away from the only place she had ever felt, in the most private chamber of herself at home. Behind her, deep beneath the palace foundation, the fault line shifted. Patient, inevitable, and for the first time in 3 years, entirely alone. The crack appeared on a Tuesday. It was a guard named Oswin who noticed it first, a young man, barely 20. Assigned to the East Corridor night rotation for the 3rd week running, because the senior guards had claimed the more comfortable posts, and no one had thought to argue with the hierarchy. Oswin was not a perceptive person by nature, but he was bored. And boredom has a way of sharpening the eyes toward whatever is different from the night before. He had been running his hand along the eastern wall out of pure restlessness when his fingers found the interruption, a line, thin as a thread, running diagonally from a point at roughly shoulder height down toward the base of the wall. He brought his torch closer. The crack was clean-edged and pale against the darker granite. The kind of fresh break that had not yet collected the dust that would eventually make it invisible. He reported it to his supervisor at the shift change. His supervisor looked at it, pressed a thumb against it with the confidence of someone performing competence rather than possessing it, and said it was natural settling. Old palace. Old stone. Nothing to concern anyone. Lord Fenwick, informed the same morning as a courtesy, did not even look up from his modernization blueprints. Ancient construction, he said, to no one in particular. Pre-existing. File it under cosmetic maintenance and move on. The report was filed. The crack was not filled, and 2 days later, it was 4 inches longer. Caelum Dawnmere, Alpha King of the realm, did not walk his own corridors often. This was not laziness, or not entirely laziness, but rather the accumulated weight of a schedule, constructed by other people around the premise that a king's time was too valuable for corridor walking. He had advisors for the corridors. He had staff for the corridors. He had an entire infrastructure of intermediaries whose purpose was to stand between him and the operational reality of his own palace, summarizing and filtering and presenting, so that he received only the information deemed worthy of his attention. It was a deeply efficient system with a profound and specific flaw, which was that it could only deliver information about things people already knew to look for. On the 14th day after Maren's departure, Caelum walked the East Corridor. He could not have explained why. There was no appointment there, no inspection scheduled. No reason endorsed by his calendar or his advisors. He had simply been standing at his study window in the early evening, looking out at the palace's eastern facade, and felt something, not a thought, not a concern exactly, but a quality of unease that had no clear object. The kind of feeling that in a person with more practice at self-examination might have been recognized as instinct. He walked the corridor alone, without announcement. The guards on duty straightened at his appearance with the startled precision of people caught, not expecting to be observed. He waved them back to ease. The crack was not difficult to find. It was, in fact, significantly easier to find than a crack in a palace wall had any right to be. It had grown in the 2 days since Oswin's report, running now from shoulder height all the way to the base of the wall, and a second, thinner line had branched from it like a river finding a new channel. Caelum crouched, pressed his fingers against the crack the way Oswin's supervisor had done, but with less performance and more genuine uncertainty. The stone was cold. Just stone. He felt nothing. He stayed crouched for longer than was comfortable. Long enough for the guards at the end of the corridor to exchange a glance they thought he could not see. Then he stood, said nothing, and walked back to his study, where he spent the remainder of the evening with the unease still sitting in his chest, unresolved. He did not yet connect it to the expulsion order. The expulsion order had been one of 47 documents he had signed that day, 3 weeks ago, and he retained approximately the same memory of it as he retained of the other 46, which was to say, none at all. That same night, 140 miles away, in the small gray house in Ashveil village where her childhood bedroom still smelled of chalk dust and old timber, Maren woke from the deepest sleep she had experienced in 3 years. She sat upright in the dark, gasping, with both hands pressed flat against the mattress beneath her, an instinctive, reflexive contact seeking that she recognized immediately for what it was. Her gift was reaching, searching. Finding nothing beneath her palms but wool and straw, it reached further, through the earth below the house, through 140 miles of soil and bedrock and ancient geological memory, toward the place it had spent 3 years learning. She felt the crack. Not its physical dimensions, the distance was too great for that level of precision, but its emotional truth, if stone could be said to have emotional truth. The palace's distress was a frequency she recognized the way she recognized her own heartbeat. Something was wrong. Something was beginning. She sat in the dark for a long time, her hands flat on the mattress, breathing carefully. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, directed at nothing and no one in the room with her, "Not yet." She meant it as a command. She meant it as a promise. She was not entirely sure, in the complicated geography of her own heart, to whom she was making it. She did not sleep again that night. She lay with her palms pressed flat against the floorboards and felt, faintly but unmistakably, the old fault line moving beneath the palace she had left behind, patient, inevitable, and no longer answered. The measurement was taken on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after Maren walked through the palace gate for the last time, by a structural engineer named Aldous Brent, who had been brought in from the capital at considerable expense, and who was, by his own assessment and the assessment of most people who had worked with him, extremely good at his job. He stood in the East Wing's main corridor with a precision level, a long, calibrated instrument of brass and glass that he had carried in a leather case for 20 years, and he watched the bubble inside it drift. Not dramatically, not in the way of collapsing buildings and immediate danger, but with the quiet, certain wrongness of something that should have been still and was not. Half a degree off true vertical. He measured it 3 times. He measured it at 4 points along the corridor's length. He brought in a second instrument and cross-checked. He went outside and looked at the East Wing's exterior facade with the practiced eye of a man who had seen buildings fail in every way a building could fail. And he confirmed what his instruments were telling him. The East Wing of Caelum Palace was tilting. Not catastrophically, not today, and perhaps not for some months, but measurably, undeniably, and, most disturbingly, recently. The tilt bore none of the characteristics of long-term gradual settlement. The stone showed fresh stress patterns. The mortar at several key junctions had cracked in ways that spoke of rapid load redistribution rather than the slow surrender of age. Whatever was happening to this wing had begun, or dramatically accelerated, within the last 2 months. Aldous Brent filed his report that afternoon and requested an urgent meeting with the king. He was given an appointment for 3 days later, which was the earliest available slot on Caelum's schedule, and which told him everything he needed to know about how seriously the palace's administrative infrastructure was taking this. In the meantime, Lord Fenwick convened his own emergency meeting with the 4 structural engineers he had brought as part of his modernization initiative. These were competent men in the narrow sense, educated, credentialed, experienced with the kind of construction that happened in controlled environments with modern materials and predictable variables. They were not, however, experienced with 300-year-old granite palace foundations built atop active fault geology, and their collective unfamiliarity with this context expressed itself in a way that was almost universal among experts operating outside their competence, with great confidence and maximum volume. The agreed conclusion of Fenwick's team was delivered to him in a document that used the phrase pre-existing geological instability 7 times and the phrase recent maintenance failure 0 times. It attributed the tilt to conditions predating the current administration's arrival. It recommended a program of modern reinforcement that would coincidentally require the full implementation of the modernization initiative's planned interventions. It did not mention the expulsion of the palace's Omega maintenance worker. It did not note the date on which the tilt had begun relative to that expulsion. It did not ask whether these 2 events might be connected. Fenwick read it, approved it, and forwarded it to the king's office with a cover note expressing confidence in his team's assessment and recommending immediate approval of the reinforcement program. The evacuation preparations began the following morning. The East Wing housed 43 staff members, 12 of whom were Omegas in the maintenance and domestic service categories, sleeping in the service block where Maren had kept her narrow bed for 3 years. They were given 4 hours to gather their belongings and relocate to temporary quarters in the North Wing's overflow rooms, smaller, colder, further from the kitchens, with no natural light in the rooms assigned to the maintenance staff. They relocated without complaint, because complaint was not a language the palace's official channels had ever been configured to receive from this particular group. Among the evacuating staff was a girl named Caelum, 17 years old, first year in palace service, assigned to kitchen assistance, but spending most of her actual hours trailing after the more experienced maintenance workers trying to learn the palace's geography. She was the one who had left small offerings of bread near Maren's corner of the maintenance hall. Not out of any strategic calculation, but simply because she had watched Maren work for 6 months and had developed the specific, inarticulate devotion that young people sometimes develop for people who are quietly extraordinary in ways the world has not yet noticed. Caelum gathered her belongings in the 4 hours allotted, carried them to the North Wing overflow room she had been assigned, and sat on the edge of her new narrow bed looking at the wall opposite. Then she turned to the girl beside her, another kitchen assistant named Wynne, a year older and considerably more cynical, and said something that she intended as a private observation between 2 people making sense of a difficult morning. It started when she left. Wynne looked at her sideways. What did? The cracks, the tilting, all of it. Caelum pressed her lips together. Maren used to touch the walls every morning. I used to watch her. I thought it was, I don't know, something she did. But it started the week after she left. All the problems. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Wynne was quiet for a moment. Then, don't say that to anyone with authority. I know. They sat in silence. Down the corridor, someone was directing the movement of furniture. The sounds of institutional relocation, efficient, impersonal, entirely unconcerned with what Caelum had just said, filled the space where a more attentive world might have placed a pause, a question, a moment of genuine inquiry. No one with authority heard her. But across the palace, in his study, Aldous Brent was doing what good engineers do when presented with a problem that resists explanation. He was going further back. He pulled the palace's full maintenance records. He cross-referenced dates. He looked for the point at which the rate of change had accelerated. He found it immediately. And then he found the name attached to the date. The riverbank at the eastern edge of Ashveil village had been failing for 2 seasons. It was not a dramatic failure, nothing in Ashveil ever was, but a slow, patient surrender of earth to water, the kind that happens when a river decides, over years, that it prefers a slightly different course and begins the quiet work of convincing the land around it The farmers whose fields bordered the bank had been losing inches of workable soil each spring flood, and the village council had discussed it at 4 consecutive meetings and reached 4 consecutive non-conclusions. Because the problem was geological and the village's collective expertise was agricultural, and the gap between those two things was not easily crossed. Maren had been working the riverbank for 11 days when the envoy arrived. She was crouched at the water's edge in the early afternoon, both palms pressed flat against the exposed root system of the bank's eroding face, not the roots themselves, but the compacted earth between them, where the real structural conversation was happening. The soil here spoke differently than stone. It was less patient, more immediate, its distress expressed in a higher register. She had spent the first 3 days simply listening before she began to respond. And now the bank was doing something that the farmers watching from a cautious distance had begun describing to each other in low, wondering voices as holding. Welcome back to the Alpha King Rain channel. Today I'm bringing you a brand new and incredibly captivating story that will surely enthrall you if you listen to the whole video. The story is entirely fictional. The video is created using AI, and it's designed to provide value, entertainment, and positive education for viewers aged 13 and up. Now, let's dive into today's story. The cracks were filling. Not with anything visible, no mortar, no material intervention. Just holding. The way a hand pressed against a wound holds. The way presence sometimes is the intervention. She heard the horse before she saw it. A single rider, moving at the deliberate pace of someone following directions to an unfamiliar location. She did not lift her hands from the earth. Whoever it was could wait, or could not, and either way the bank needed another 10 minutes. The envoy, a young palace official in the formal gray and gold of Caelum's administrative service, dismounted at the edge of the field and walked toward her with the careful steps of someone trying to preserve the cleanliness of shoes that had not been designed for riverbanks. He stopped a few feet away and waited. When she still did not turn, he cleared his throat. I am looking for Maren Ashveil. I was told she would be here. You found her? A pause. He had clearly expected her to stand. She did not. She had 4 minutes left and the bank was at a critical point of stabilization. And she had learned long ago that the world's impatience was not her emergency. After a moment, with the slightly deflated quality of someone recalibrating their approach, the envoy crouched to something closer to her level and produced a sealed letter from his coat. This is from His Majesty, King Caelum Donmere. You are requested to return to the palace immediately to assist with an urgent structural matter. Requested. Yes. Not ordered. Another pause, more careful. His Majesty used the word requested. Maren was quiet for 2 more minutes, her hands still flat against the earth. The bank held. She felt the stabilization complete. Not perfectly, it would need more work, but enough to last through the next rainfall. She sat back on her heels, brushed the soil from her palms, and took the letter. She read it without urgency, the way she had read her expulsion notice, once completely, with the particular attention of someone who has learned that documents contain not just what they say, but how they say it, and that the gap between those two things is where the truth usually lives. The letter was formal, carefully worded, and notable for what it did not contain. It did not contain an apology. It did not contain an acknowledgement of error. It contained a description of the structural situation, a statement of urgency, and a request for her specialized assistance, with the implication of restored compensation. She folded it in half and looked at the envoy, who had the expression of a man who had been told this would be straightforward. I have 3 conditions. His expression shifted. I was instructed to convey the king's request and facilitate your return. I was not told to expect. 3 conditions. Her voice was pleasant, unhurried, and entirely immovable. First, a written acknowledgement, signed by the king, that the expulsion was an error in judgment, not a procedural correction, not an administrative review, an acknowledgement. Second, full restoration of my palace staff status, with back pay calculated from the date of expulsion. Third, written authorization granting me the right to conduct maintenance activities anywhere in the palace, at any hour, without interference, oversight, or the requirement to explain my methods to anyone. The envoy stared at her. He was young enough that his face had not yet learned to conceal its reactions, and his reaction was transparent. He had been sent to retrieve a grateful Omega maintenance worker, and instead found himself crouched on a failing riverbank negotiating with someone who had apparently spent the last 6 weeks becoming a different person. She waited. Across the field, one of the farmers had stopped working and was watching with the quiet attention of someone witnessing something worth remembering. "I will need to relay these conditions to His Majesty," the envoy said finally. "Of course. There may be," he searched for the word, resistance, "to the terms." Maren looked at him steadily. "The east wing is tilting at approximately half a degree off vertical and accelerating. The fault line beneath the foundation is active and has been unmanaged for 6 weeks. His Majesty may take as much time as he needs to consider resistance." The envoy left within the hour, riding considerably faster than he had arrived. Maren turned back to the riverbank and pressed her palms flat against the earth again. She was not going back out of loyalty. She was not going back out of forgiveness. She was not even going back, she told herself, out of love for the palace's stone. She was going back because she had decided to, and that decision, freely made, on her own terms, was something she had never had before. She was discovering a remarkable thing to hold. She arrived at dawn. Not because she had been instructed to, not because the timing had been coordinated by anyone in the palace's administrative machinery, but because dawn was when she had always arrived, when the light was still gray and uncertain, when the corridors belonged to the silence before the day filled them with noise and purpose and the performance of importance. It was the hour she knew best, the hour the palace knew her best. The gate guards had been told to expect her. She could see it in the way they straightened when her figure appeared at the end of the approach road, not the casual straightening of men responding to an unexpected arrival, but the specific, slightly uncomfortable precision of men who had been given instructions about someone they might otherwise have turned away. They opened the gate without speaking. She walked through without ceremony. The moment she crossed the threshold, the palace exhaled. She felt it in her hands before she touched anything, a wave of recognition that moved through the stone around her like a shiver, like the particular quality of relief that a held breath produces when it is finally released. The walls knew her. The floor knew her. She had spent 3 years in daily conversation with this building, and it had, in whatever language stone uses for such things, been waiting. She did not allow herself to feel the fullness of that. Not yet. She kept her arms at her sides, her bag over one shoulder, and walked toward the east corridor the way she had walked toward every difficult thing in her life, with her eyes open and her expectations carefully, deliberately lowered. He was there. She had not been told he would be. The envoy's return message, conveying the king's agreement to all 3 conditions, had said only that she would be met by the palace steward upon arrival and escorted to her restored quarters. There had been no mention of the king himself standing alone in the east corridor in the early morning, no retinue, no advisors, no performance of royal dignity, just a tall man in a plain dark coat looking at the cracks in his wall with the expression of someone trying to understand a language they had never been taught. He turned when he heard her steps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She had seen him before, of course, in the way that people who occupy vastly different levels of the same building see each other, which is to say at a distance, in profile, briefly, and without contact. She had carried her maintenance cart past rooms where he was meeting with advisors. She had worked corridors he had walked through hours earlier. She knew the shape of his presence in the palace the way she knew the shape of every structural element, by its effect on the space around it rather than by direct examination. This was the first time he had ever looked directly at her. She held the eye contact for exactly as long as felt honest, which was perhaps 3 seconds, then shifted her gaze to the wall, to the cracks. She walked toward them without asking permission, because the written authorization in her pocket gave her that right, and she had negotiated for it precisely because she had known there would be moments like this one, where she would need its weight behind her. She pressed both palms flat against the wall and closed her eyes. The stone's response was immediate and overwhelming, not distress exactly, but the equivalent of a long and urgent account delivered all at once by something that had been waiting too long to speak. She absorbed it, sorted it, felt the full geography of what 6 weeks of unmanaged stress had produced. It was worse than she had calculated from a distance. Not irreversible, but worse. She stayed like that for a long time. long enough that her awareness of him, standing behind her, watching, not speaking, became part of the scene's texture rather than its interruption. He did not pace. He did not clear his throat. He did not offer instructions or ask questions or perform the restlessness that powerful people often performed when they were not in control of a situation. He simply watched. When she finally opened her eyes and lowered her hands, she did not turn around immediately. She stood looking at the wall, at the network of cracks that her gift had just mapped with painful precision, and she breathed through the weight of what she now knew about the work ahead. Then she turned. He was closer than she had expected. Not inappropriately close. He had not moved toward her, she realized, so much as she had not registered how near he had been standing when she began. The space between them was perhaps 4 feet, which in an empty corridor felt like a charged and specific distance. She had prepared, in the nights since agreeing to return, for several versions of this first encounter. Formal authority, defensive justification, the particular condescension of powerful people who have made an error and respond by making themselves larger to compensate. She had not prepared for this, for the expression she found on his face when she finally looked at it properly. Open in a way that royal faces were almost never open. Unguarded in a way that spoke not of weakness, but of something that required more courage from him than a formal apology would have. It looked impossibly like shame. Clean, genuine, unperformed shame, the kind that cannot be delegated or signed away with a document. The kind that lives in a person's face when they have finally, fully understood something they cannot take back. Maren looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the wall. "The west corridor is next," she said quietly. "But the east can be stabilized first. I will need 2 weeks." Behind her, she heard him breathe. Caelum did not sleep that night. This was not unusual. Insomnia had been a companion of his since the early years of his reign. When the weight of decisions made in daylight had a habit of returning at midnight with their full consequences attached. He had learned to use the sleepless hours productively, reading reports, reviewing correspondence, preparing for the morning's councils. He had become, over time, a man who was very good at filling silence with function. Tonight, however, the reports sat unread on his desk. The correspondence remained sealed. He stood at his window and looked at the east wing's exterior in the darkness, watching for something he could not name, and eventually stopped pretending he was going to sleep and walked instead to the palace records room. It was a long, low-ceilinged room on the administrative floor, lined from floor to ceiling with the accumulated documentation of the palace's operational life, ledgers, reports, maintenance logs, inventory records, staff rosters. It smelled of old paper and the particular kind of dust that collects only in places where information is stored but rarely retrieved. He found the maintenance section by the labels on the shelving, written in a small, precise administrative hand that he did not recognize as hers, not yet. He pulled the logs for the past 3 years and carried them to the reading table. He opened the first one. The handwriting inside was different from the labels, smaller, more careful, with the quality of someone writing for precision rather than legibility. Each entry was dated, timed, and structured with a methodical consistency that spoke of someone who understood that their records might be the only testimony their work ever received. He read the first entry, then the second. Then he turned pages more slowly, because he had begun to understand what he was reading. Southeast pillar showing increased lateral pressure. Source traced to weight redistribution from upper floor renovation. Sustained contact applied for 40 minutes. Pressure response confirmed. Will monitor. Ancient fracture in King's Corridor. Base of third pillar from northern entrance. Diagonal orientation, approximately 11 inches. Has not progressed. Maintained through regular contact. No external intervention required at this time. East wing foundation, fault activity elevated this week. Extended session required. 2 hours of contact applied to primary stress points. Stabilization confirmed but activity increasing. Recommend continued close monitoring. He read for 2 hours without stopping. The logs were not dramatic. They were not written for an audience. They were the working record of someone who had spent 3 years doing an essential job with complete seriousness. Documenting everything with the conscientious precision of a person who believed that the record mattered, even if no one ever read it. Entry after entry, daily. sometimes twice daily, tracking the palace's structural health with a granularity and accuracy that no engineering firm had ever produced for him, because no engineering firm had possessed her particular instrument. He found the entries from the months surrounding the underground tremor 4 years ago, the one that the palace's official record listed as negligible. Her entries from that period were longer, more urgent, the handwriting slightly less even, suggesting sessions that had been physically demanding. The word stabilized appeared 14 times in a 3-week period. The word critical appeared twice, underlined, the only departure from her otherwise unvarying clinical tone. He thought about the word critical, underlined, in a log that had sat in this records room for 4 years unread. He turned to the last entry. The date was the morning of her expulsion. The entry read, East Corridor Primary Stress Points Addressed. Foundation monitoring complete. Fault activity within acceptable parameters. Continued daily maintenance essential. Cessation of intervention not recommended. The last line, written the morning she left. A warning clear and specific, addressed to no one, filed in a room no one visited. Composed by a person who had known exactly what would happen when she stopped, and had documented that knowledge with the same careful precision she brought to everything else, in the full understanding that no one would read it until it was too late. He closed the log. He sat at the reading table in the records room for a long time. In the specific quality of silence that follows understanding, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something that has just become true and cannot be made untrue. He thought about the expulsion order. He tried genuinely to reconstruct the moment of signing it. 47 documents that day. Reports, approvals, correspondence, administrative decisions large and small. Fenwick's report had been, he believed, toward the end of the stack. He had a faint memory of the description. Omega maintenance worker, eccentric behavior, recommended review. He had a fainter memory of thinking that Fenwick's role justified his judgment of his own staff matters. He did not have any memory of the name on the document. He was not certain he had read it. He pulled the maintenance log toward him again and opened it to the first entry, dated 3 years and 4 months ago. He read the date, the time, the precise description of a stress fracture in the southeast pillar, and the action taken. Then he turned to the very back of the final volume, where the inside cover held a small pocket for supplementary documents, and found something he had not expected, a single folded sheet, tucked there as if saved for a particular purpose. He unfolded it. In her careful handwriting, the fault beneath the east wing is active. Without sustained intervention, critical failure estimated within 18 months of cessation. 18 months. Written 4 years ago. She had known. She had always known. He sat with that for a long time. Then he closed the log, placed it carefully back on the shelf exactly as he had found it, and walked back to his study. He did not sleep before dawn. But for the first time in weeks, the unease in his chest had a name, and naming it, he understood, was only the beginning. She was working the west corridor at midnight when she heard his footsteps. She knew them now, had learned them in the past week the way she learned everything, through attention and pattern, and the particular sensitivity that her gift gave her to vibration traveling through stone. His stride was longer than most, unhurried in a way that was not laziness, but the particular quality of a man who had learned to move through his own palace as if it belonged to him, which of course it did. Though she was beginning to understand that ownership and knowledge were not the same thing, and that he was only now beginning to suspect this himself. She kept her palms on the wall. She was in the middle of something, a stress point in the west corridor's central arch that had been developing for 3 weeks of her absence and required sustained, focused attention. Whatever he needed could wait, or he could stand beside her while she finished, and either option was acceptable. He chose to stand beside her. Not speaking, not performing the authority that his presence automatically carried into any room. He simply stood at a comfortable distance, far enough for respect, close enough that she was aware of him, and waited with a patience she had not expected from him. When she finally lowered her hands and turned, she found him holding 2 cups. Plain ceramic cups. The kind that came from the service kitchen rather than the royal dining service. Steam rising from both. She looked at the cups, then at him. "Tea," he said, with the slightly uncertain quality of someone who has prepared for a gesture and is now uncertain whether the gesture is appropriate. "I did not know how you take it. I brought it plain. Plain is fine. She took the cup. The ceramic was warm against her palms in the ordinary, uncomplicated way that warmth sometimes is, not the deep communication of stone but something simpler and, in its simplicity, unexpectedly affecting. They stood in the west corridor in the midnight quiet and drank tea, and for a while neither of them spoke. And the silence was not uncomfortable in the way that silence between people of vastly different positions usually is. It was the silence of two people who were both, in their different ways, trying to locate the honest version of themselves for this conversation. He spoke first. The maintenance logs. He turned the cup in his hands. I read all 3 years. She said nothing. Waited. You documented everything. Every fracture, every stress point, every session. He paused. You wrote a warning about the East Wing fault line 4 years ago, and filed it in the back of the final volume. I did. Why there? Why not submit it formally? Why not bring it to the steward, to an engineer, to anyone with the authority to act on it? The question was genuine. She could hear that it was. Could hear the real bewilderment in it rather than accusation, and she considered it honestly before she answered. Because the last time I told the truth about what I felt in stone, I was 9 years old. And the adults in the room laughed at me. A beat. And then the wall fell. And then they called me a bad omen. She looked at the arch above them, at the old stone she had just spent an hour steadying. I learned that being right was not protection. I learned to put things in writing in places where they would exist but not require me to defend them to someone who had already decided what I was. The silence after this was of a different quality than the one before. He was absorbing it. She could see the absorption. The specific stillness of a person taking something in rather than preparing a response. What I was in this palace, she continued more quietly, was maintenance staff. 3rd tier. That is what the documents said. That is what everyone saw. The logs were, they were me knowing that someone eventually might look. I should have looked sooner. Yes. No softening. No gracious deflection of his guilt back into something more comfortable for both of them. Just agreement, clear and honest. Because she had decided when she walked back through the gate that she was done editing her truth for other people's comfort. He received it without flinching. That surprised her. Tell me about it, he said. Your gift. Not the logs. Not the engineering. Tell me what it actually is, what it feels like. She looked at him for a moment, measuring the question. Then she turned to the wall beside them and pressed her palm flat. And she described it, the resonance, the conversation. The way stone carried memory and pressure, and something that was not quite emotion but functioned similarly. She described the fault line beneath the east wing the way you would describe a sleeping animal, with respect for its power and awareness of its patience. She described what 3 years of daily communion with the palace's structure had felt like from the inside, like belonging to something, even when that something did not know her name. He listened, not with the performative attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with the full, quiet presence of someone receiving what was being given them. When she finished, the corridor was still around them, the stone warm beneath her hand. What does the palace feel like right now? His voice was careful, genuine. She was quiet for a long moment, her palms still flat against the wall. Afraid, she said, but better than it was yesterday. He nodded slowly, as if this were information he intended to keep. He turned to leave, and she watched him go, his footsteps moving away down the corridor in the pattern she had already learned. He paused, did not turn around, but his steps slowed just perceptibly, and she heard him say, quiet enough that it was almost to himself. The West Wing. You said it was manageable. If you stayed. She did not answer. She turned back to the wall and pressed both palms flat. Beneath her hands, the stone hummed, steadier than yesterday, steadier than the week before. Something was settling. Not just the stone. The meeting took place in Lord Fenwick's private office on a Thursday evening. After the day's official business had concluded and the administrative corridors had emptied of the witnesses that official business required. He had chosen his guests carefully. 3 senior members of the Alpha Council, men who had served on the council long enough to have developed the particular institutional instinct for self-preservation that comes from watching administrations change and learning which direction to lean when the wind shifts. Lord Harwick, who controlled the eastern trade routes and had financial interests in the modernization initiative's planned infrastructure expansions. Lord Casson, who had opposed the initiative initially, but whose opposition had been converted, through patient negotiation, into conditional support, and the oldest of the three, Lord Pembroke, who had been on the council for 30 years, and whose principal talent was the ability to make other people's agendas sound like his own ideas. Fenwick poured the wine himself, which was an intentional gesture, a signal of intimacy, of this being a conversation between men of equal standing rather than a formal briefing. He was good at these signals. He had built his career on them. "The situation," he said, settling into his chair with the ease of a man on familiar ground, "is being misread at the highest level." Harwick swirled his wine. "The East Wing is stabilizing. Whatever she is doing, it appears to be working." "What she is doing," Fenwick said, "is pressing her hands against walls, and we are allowing a king to interpret this as structural engineering." He let the sentence sit for a moment, doing its work. "The deterioration began before my team's arrival. The records are clear on this. The foundation issues predate the modernization initiative by years. What we are witnessing is a convenient narrative constructed around a correlation. She left, cracks appeared, she returned. Cracks diminish. This is not causation. This is timing exploited by a very clever Omega who understood an opportunity." Casson's expression was thoughtful, cautious. "The structural engineers report. Aldous Brent is a competent man who found a date correlation and drew the most dramatic conclusion available to him. He is not a scientist. He is not qualified to assess what she is doing or whether it has any relationship to the palace's structural condition." Fenwick kept his voice measured, reasonable. The voice of a man presenting facts rather than constructing a case. "What is qualified assessment? What is evidence? The palace has been settling for 3 centuries. We have brought in modern reinforcement methods with documented, peer-reviewed efficacy. The stabilization we are seeing now is the beginning of that reinforcement taking effect. Her presence is coincidental." Pembroke, who had been quiet, set down his cup with the deliberate care of a man about to say something he had prepared. "What is it you are proposing, Aldrich?" Fenwick looked at him steadily. "A formal council inquiry into the basis for her reinstatement, on the grounds that the reinstatement was made under duress, a king responding to an apparent crisis without adequate evidentiary basis. If we can demonstrate that the structural recovery is attributable to the reinforcement program rather than to her methods, then her continued presence and the extraordinary access she has been granted becomes not just unnecessary but inappropriate." The room was quiet for a moment. "And if she can demonstrate the opposite?" Harwick asked. "She cannot." Fenwick's voice was flat, certain. "She presses her hands against stone. There is no instrument that measures what she claims to do. There is no scientific framework within which her methods can be validated. In a formal inquiry, before the full council, she will be asked to provide evidence that meets evidential standards. She cannot. And when she cannot, the inquiry's conclusion writes itself." What Fenwick did not say, what lived in the space beneath the strategy he was presenting, was the simpler, more urgent truth. That Maren's presence and the growing attention the king was paying to her had become, in the 5 weeks since her return, a direct threat to everything he had spent the past 2 years building. The modernization initiative was his legacy, his proof of value, the architecture of his influence in this kingdom. If the official record concluded that an Omega maintenance worker had been providing structural support that his entire engineering team had failed to replicate, then his initiative was not modernization. It was replacement of something that worked with something that didn't. And that was not a record he intended to carry. Pembroke nodded slowly. "I will draft the inquiry motion." Casson said nothing, but he did not object, which in the economy of this particular room was the same thing. Harwick looked into his wine. "The king will not be pleased." "The king," Fenwick said carefully, "has been spending his midnight hours in empty corridors drinking tea with a maintenance worker. His judgment in this matter is compromised. It is the council's responsibility to provide the oversight his position requires." A pause. "We are protecting him from a situation he is too close to see clearly." The meeting concluded 20 minutes later. The 3 council members left through different exits at intervals. In the careful choreography of men who understood that the appearance of coincidence was its own form of power. Fenwick remained alone in his office, looking at the modernization blueprints spread across his desk. He was not a cruel man, he told himself. He was a practical one. And practically speaking, a kingdom did not run on wall-touching and intuition. It ran on systems, structures, measurable, reproducible, documentable methods. He believed this. He needed to believe it. Across the palace, in the Eastern Foundation's deepest corridor, Maren worked past midnight with her palms flat against the ancient stone. She was focused, absorbed, and then she paused. Something had changed in the vibration around her. Not geological, not structural. Something that moved through the palace's corridors and patterns, specific routes, repeated sequences, the purposeful geography of human intent. Footsteps. The same footsteps, 3 different sets, moving through the administrative wing at intervals too deliberate to be accidental. She could not have said what it meant, but she had spent 3 years learning to trust what the stone told her, and what it told her now. In the low language of vibration and frequency and the ancient memory of building, was this: something is moving, and it is moving toward you. The summons arrived before dawn, slipped beneath the door of her restored quarters while she was still in the Eastern Foundation corridor, finishing the night's final session. She found it when she returned, a folded document sealed with 2 marks she recognized immediately. The Alpha Council's formal crest on the left, Lord Fenwick's personal seal on the right. The combination was not subtle. It was designed to communicate precisely what it communicated. That this was not a request from one man, but a mobilization of institutional authority, the kind that did not leave room for negotiation. She picked it up, set it on her maintenance table beside her cooling morning tea, sat down. Read it. The language was formal, precise, and constructed with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew how to make an ambush sound like procedure. She was summoned to appear before the full Alpha Council in 3 days' time to respond to questions regarding the basis and validity of her reinstatement, the nature of her claimed methods, and the appropriateness of the access she had been granted. She was informed that the inquiry had been initiated under the Council's oversight mandate and carried the full authority of that mandate. She was reminded, in the document's final paragraph, of her status as palace maintenance staff. 3rd tier, a designation that carried with it no right of legal representation and no formal standing to introduce evidence without council permission. 3rd tier. Still, even after everything. She set the document down and looked at her tea. It had gone cold while she was working, the way it always did. She had grown used to cold tea. She had grown used to a great many things that she was now, slowly, understanding she should not have grown used to at all. She heard the knock at her door before she had decided what to do about any of it. Caelum did not wait for her to invite him in. He opened the door and stepped inside with the controlled urgency of someone who had been awake long. Enough that the morning had circled back around to feeling like night again. He was not in formal dress, plain dark coat, no insignia. The same presentation he brought to their midnight corridor conversations, which she had come to understand was not an oversight, but a choice. He had a copy of the summons in his hand. His eyes found hers immediately. I read it an hour ago. Pembroke's motion, Fenwick's seal. This is, he stopped, composed himself with visible effort. I want you to know that I did not sanction this inquiry. The council has the procedural right to initiate oversight reviews without my signature, but I intend to. To what? Her voice was quiet, not cold, but precise in the way of someone who has thought clearly about what they are about to say. To stand with me? Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. He was standing in the center of her small quarters, a king in a maintenance worker's room, holding a copy of a document designed to remove her, with an expression that was as genuinely distressed as anything she had seen on his face. She believed the distress. She had spent enough time in his presence now to understand the difference between his performed composure and his actual interior state. And what she was seeing right now was the actual interior state of a man who understood, too late and too clearly, the shape of what he had set in motion months ago with a signature he did not remember giving. You didn't stand with me when it mattered, she said. Not with anger. She had moved through anger already, in the weeks at the riverbank. And what remained was something clearer and more useful. When Lord Fenwick filed his report, you signed the expulsion order without reading my name. without knowing anything about me, without asking a single question about what I was actually doing or why. A pause. I am not telling you this to cause pain. I am telling you this because if you're going to stand with me now, I need you to understand the difference between standing with me because you feel guilty and standing with me because you have genuinely understood what happened and why it cannot happen again. The silence that followed was long and honest in the way that only silences can be when both people in them are telling the truth. I understand the difference, he said finally. His voice was lower than usual, carrying something she did not have a word for yet, something that had been developing across the midnight conversations, across the cups of plain tea, across the readings of 3 years of maintenance logs in a dusty records room. And I understand that my understanding does not undo what I did. But I am asking to stand with you anyway. Not for my guilt. For what is right. She looked at him. He held the eye contact with the steadiness of someone who had decided something and was not retreating from it. The council will expect me to demonstrate my gift under formal conditions, she said. They will bring experts to dispute it. They will use procedural rules to limit what I can present. And Fennec will be there. With 3 years of professional credibility and the full weight of the modernization initiative behind him. I know. Then you also know that your support, however sincere, will not be enough on its own. I will need to demonstrate, not explain, not argue. Demonstrate in terms that cannot be dismissed. Can you do that? She thought of the palace's stone beneath her hands, the fractures she had sealed, the fault line she had been managing for 3 years while no one asked her name. Yes, she said. But I will do it on my own terms. I will not perform for their comfort. I will not beg for their belief. I will show them what is true, and they can decide what to do with it. She reached across the table and picked up the summons, folded it in half with the same deliberate precision she had used on her expulsion notice. All those weeks ago, but this time, she did not put it in her pocket like something to be survived. She set it flat on the table in front of her like something to be answered. She began at the north corridor and worked her way south. It was past 10 in the evening when she started, and she did not hurry. Because hurrying was not how this worked, and had never been how this worked. The palace required patience. It had always required patience. 3 years of pre-dawn mornings had taught her that the stone gave up its truths gradually. In layers, the way trust is given, not all at once and not on demand, but in response to sustained, genuine attention. She moved through the corridors methodically, pressing her palms to each weight-bearing wall, each pillar, each arch and junction, and foundational point. She had come to know the way she knew the lines of her own hands. The north corridor, stable, its old tension well managed, humming with the particular contentment of stone that has been consistently cared for. The administrative wing's main load-bearing wall, solid. A minor stress point near its eastern junction that she addressed in 10 quiet minutes. The great staircase, patient, proud, carrying its centuries well. She was not doing this for the hearing tomorrow. She was doing it because this was what she did, what she had always done. And the hearing tomorrow was simply a context that had grown up around a practice that predated it and would outlast it regardless of outcome. Though she was also, she admitted to herself as she worked, moving through the palace tonight with the particular intentionality of someone who needs to understand what they are about to defend. She had spent 3 years here. She had given this building something real, not out of obligation, not for recognition, but because her gift compelled it, and because the palace needed it, and because somewhere in the complicated architecture of her own heart, she had loved this place. Not its hierarchy, not its power structures or its courtiers or its invisible boundaries of rank and status. The stone itself, the ancient, patient, profoundly communicative stone that had been holding up the lives of 3,000 people, day after day, in the long and uncelebrated way that essential things always hold. She thought about what Fennec would say tomorrow. She had constructed his argument with careful precision, because she had learned young that the best way to survive something was to see it clearly. He would say, "Show us the evidence." He would say, "Demonstrate the measurable, reproducible, scientifically validated mechanism." He would say, "Your presence correlates with stability, but correlation is not causation. And the palace's recovery, since your return, is attributable to our reinforcement program. And you are a maintenance worker who presses her hands against walls and calls it engineering." And the terrible, clarifying truth was that he was not entirely wrong about the difficulty of her position. What she did could not be put under a microscope. It could not be graphed or quantified or expressed in any language that the Alpha Council's formal evidentiary standards would recognize. She had no credentials. She had no peer-reviewed framework. She had maintenance logs and outcomes, and the word of a 23-year-old Omega woman who had spent 3 years being invisible in a palace that had not known her name. But she also had the fractures. She had the specific, measurable, verifiable truth of them, their locations, their dimensions. Their rate of change, all of it documented in her logs, and all of it, she was certain, confirmable by any instrument sensitive enough to find what she had already found by touch. She was thinking about this when she reached the Great Hall. She had saved it for last, though she had not consciously planned to. It was the largest space in the palace, the room where the council met, where proclamations were made, where the formal business of the kingdom was conducted with all the ceremony that power requires when it wants to remind itself of its own significance. She had rarely worked in here. The Great Hall's stone was different from the rest of the palace, younger in relative terms. Rebuilt 2 centuries ago after a fire had damaged the original structure, and therefore less communicative, its memory shorter, its personality less established. She pressed her palms to the central pillar and waited for the stone to speak. What came back was not the familiar conversation she knew from the older corridors. It was something else, deeper, stranger, more resonant. As if the pillar were not simply responding to her touch, but recognizing her. Not as a maintenance worker. Not as the woman who had been pressing her hands to palace stone for 3 years. As something she had no word for yet. She kept her palms flat. She kept her breathing steady. She waited for the recognition to clarify itself. And in the deep, ancient silence of the Great Hall, with the hearing 12 hours away and everything uncertain, something in the stone reached back. The recognition deepened slowly, the way dawn deepens, not in a single moment, but in the gradual accumulation of light until the darkness is simply no longer there. Maren stood with both palms flat against the Great Hall's central pillar and felt something she had never felt before in 3 years of daily communion with palace stone. It was not a stress fracture. It was not a load distribution problem or a geological instability or any of the structural conversations she knew how to have. It was older than any of that. It was the palace's full memory, not just the 2 centuries of the rebuilt hall, but something that reached beneath the reconstruction to the original foundation, to the first stones laid on this ground 3 centuries ago, to the hands that had placed them and the intention behind that placement. The palace remembered being built. She understood this the way she understood everything her gift gave her, not in words, not in images, but in the pure informational language of resonance. She felt the memory of the original builders, not as people, not as individuals, but as intention. They had known what they were building on. They had known about the fault line. The original palace had been designed with the fault line in its calculations, built to work with the geological reality beneath it rather than against it. And embedded in its foundation architecture was a principle that no modern engineering document had ever captured, because no modern engineering document had thought to ask the stone. The palace was not despite the fault line. The palace was in conversation with it. This was what she had been maintaining without fully understanding. This was what her gift had been participating in without her knowing the full scope of what she was participating in. She had been the most recent in a long line, she understood now. Feeling the accumulated memory of countless hands pressed to palace stone over 3 centuries, of people with her ability who had served as the living interface between the building and the earth beneath it. Not maintenance workers, not servants, interlocutors, keepers of a dialogue that the palace itself had been designed to require. The understanding moved through her like a current, not a metaphorical current, but something physical. Something that began in her palms and moved up through her wrists and arms and into her chest and spread outward from there in a wave that she felt in her teeth, in her sternum, in the backs of her knees. She had experienced her gift intensely before, in long difficult sessions with critically damaged stone. But she had never experienced it like this, not as a giving but as a receiving, not as her feeding the stone, but as the stone feeding her in return. Offering back everything she had given over 3 years multiplied by the accumulated gift of every keeper before her. She was not aware of going to her knees. She became aware that she was on them, both hands now flat on the floor rather than the pillar. The contact point expanding instinctively as the resonance grew too large for two palms against a column to contain. The stone floor of the great hall was cold through the fabric of her work trousers, and she pressed her forehead forward until it touched the floor between her hands. And she let the full current of the palace's memory move through her without resistance. It lasted perhaps 5 minutes. It felt like an hour and an instant simultaneously. When it passed, she was breathing hard, and the cold of the stone floor was the most real thing she had ever felt, and her hands were still flat on the ground. And she understood something about herself and her gift and the nature of what she had been doing for 3 years that changed the entire architecture of how she understood her own story. She was not a maintenance worker who happened to have a useful ability. She was the latest inheritor of an ancient, intentional, essential practice, one the palace had been built to require, one that her gift had been shaped by generations of inheritance to provide. She was not incidental to this building's survival. She was structural. She was load-bearing. She was, in the most literal and profound sense available to the word, foundational. She lifted her head. Caelum was standing in the doorway of the great hall. He was in the same plain dark coat, and he was very still. And he had clearly been standing there for long enough that he had seen most of it, her hands on the pillar, the descent to her knees, the forehead pressed to the floor, the stillness, the return. His face in the doorway's dim light was open in a way she had now seen several times and still did not quite have the emotional vocabulary to fully receive. He had been standing there, she realized, for a long time. He had not interrupted. He had not moved. He had simply witnessed, with the full, quiet attention of someone who has finally understood that witnessing, sometimes, is the most important thing you can offer another person. She looked at him across the length of the great hall's stone floor. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was the fullest silence she had ever inhabited, charged with everything the night had given her, and everything she now understood, and everything that was still. Between them, unspoken and unresolved, but no longer, she thought, unresolvable. She pressed her palms flat on the floor one final time. The great hall's stone hummed back, clear, steady, recognized. Then she stood. The great hall looked different in full light. Maren had worked it in darkness the night before, felt its stone in the intimate privacy of midnight, received its deepest memory on her knees on its floor. Now it was arranged for formal business, the long council table running the hall's length. High-backed chairs filled with 11 members of the Alpha Council in their formal colors. The gallery above occupied by palace staff and minor officials who had been granted observer status, and at the far end of the table, Lord Fenwick, seated with the composed ease of a man who had chosen his terrain carefully and arrived early to settle into it. Caelum sat at the table's head. He had not, she noted, taken the elevated chair that was traditionally used for formal proceedings, the one that placed the king physically above the council members. He sat at the same level. She did not know if this was intentional. She thought it probably was. She was escorted to the floor before the table, not a seat, no chair provided. The traditional position for a person appearing before the council without formal standing. She stood. She had known this would be the arrangement. She had decided, in the pre-dawn hours after the great hall had given her back to herself, that she would not ask for a chair. Standing was fine. She had spent 3 years on her knees on cold stone floors. She could stand. Fenwick's opening statement was everything she had constructed it to be in her careful, preemptive imagination. Polished. Credentialed. Delivered with the confident fluency of a man who had given many presentations before audiences who expected to be persuaded by confidence. He cited the Modernization Initiative's reinforcement program. He cited his team's engineering credentials. He cited the absence of any validated scientific framework for the practice of what he called tactile intuition claims. He used the word superstition twice, each time with the particular delicacy of a man who wants the word's impact without its crudeness. He used the word coincidence 4 times. When he finished, the hall was quiet with the quality of an audience that has heard something persuasive and is waiting to discover whether it will be countered or confirmed. Lady Voss, the oldest member of the council, sat 3 seats from the table's head. She was perhaps 70, sharp-featured. with the particular stillness of someone who had survived long enough in powerful rooms to have learned that patience was the most lethal weapon available to the politically astute. She had said nothing during Fenwick's presentation. She said nothing now. Maren Ashveil, the council's presiding officer, Lord Casson, looked at her from the table. You have been afforded the opportunity to respond to the inquiry's basis. You may speak. She did not argue with Fenwick's words. She did not address his credentials or dispute his framework or attempt to construct a counter-narrative in the language of his narrative. She had decided this the night before, on the great hall's floor, with the palace's full memory moving through her hands. The answer to a language that cannot hear you is not to speak that language more loudly. It is to demonstrate something the language cannot describe. She walked to the central pillar. The hall watched her cross the floor with the silence of an audience that does not know what it is about to see. She heard Fenwick shift in his chair, the precise sound of a man recalibrating. She pressed both palms flat against the pillar's eastern face. She found the fracture immediately, diagonal, running from 17 inches above the base upward, clean-edged in the way of fractures that have been partially managed and then left to progress. She mapped it in 3 seconds, noted its current length, noted the rate of change encoded in the stone's stress memory. Then she stepped back and turned to face the council. This pillar has a stress fracture running 17 inches up its eastern face. It has been there for 11 years. It has not grown in 3 years because it was being managed through daily sustained contact. Since the date of my expulsion, it has grown 4 additional inches. The fracture currently runs 21 inches from the base and is progressing at a rate consistent with the removal of the stabilizing intervention. She paused. You may measure it. The silence in the hall was absolute. Caelum had risen half out of his chair without appearing to notice. Fenwick's face had undergone a series of rapid changes that had settled, finally, into the particular pallor of a man watching something he cannot stop. The council surveyor, a beta engineer who had been seated at the side of the room for precisely this kind of technical verification, crossed the floor with his measuring instrument. The hall watched. The instrument found the fracture within seconds. The surveyor measured. He measured again. He straightened and read the figure aloud. 21 inches. Precisely. The silence after this was different from the silence before it. This was the silence of 11 people absorbing something that had just become undeniable. Lord Fenwick's face was the color of ash. Lady Voss rose from her chair. Not quickly, with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of someone who has waited for the right moment and recognized it when it arrived. She looked at Maren across the length of the great hall with the focused attention of someone seeing clearly for the first time, or perhaps confirming what she had already suspected. What would it take? Lady Voss said, her voice carrying in the hall's perfect acoustics without effort. For this kingdom to never lose someone like you again? The question hung in the great hall's air like the last note of a bell, present, resonant, slowly expanding into the silence around it. Maren stood before the pillar she had just proven with the particular stillness of someone who has been asked, for the first time in her life, the question she has been preparing to answer without knowing she was preparing. Not the question of her competence. Not the question of her methods or her credentials or her right to exist in this space. The question of what it would take. What would actually structurally, permanently change the conditions that had produced what this room had just witnessed. She took a breath. She had not prepared a speech. She had not written anything down or rehearsed any particular form of words. What she had was 3 years of pre-dawn corridors and a childhood of being called a bad omen and a riverbank that held because she had pressed her hands against its failing earth and a maintenance log that had sat unread in a records room for 4 years and a fault line beneath this building that she had managed alone. In silence, without a single person ever asking her what she heard. She had more than enough material. Lady Voss. Her voice was steady, not loud. The hall's acoustics carried it without volume. You ask what it would take. I want to answer that honestly, which means I need to first say something that this room may find uncomfortable. The hall waited. The palace nearly failed not because of geological instability. Geological instability has been present beneath this foundation for 3 centuries. The palace nearly failed because the system that was managing that instability was invisible to everyone in authority, and invisible things are easy to remove. She looked across the council table, not at Fennec, not at any single face, but at the collective institution of it. I was invisible because I was Omega, third tier. Maintenance staff. My logs were filed in a room no one entered. My warnings were written in a language, maintenance notation. Technical observation. That carried no authority because I carried no authority. My gift was not assessed by its outcomes. It was assessed by its appearance. And its appearance was a woman standing alone in a corridor pressing her hands against walls at 4 a.m. She paused. Let it settle. I want to tell you about a 9-year-old girl in a village called Ashveil. She told them. She did not edit it or soften it or frame it strategically. She told them about the schoolhouse wall and the 3 days of laughter and the 4th day of collapse. She told them about her father's careful, loving instruction to be silent. She told them about 14 years of learning to exist in the interior of herself while the exterior of herself became smaller and quieter and more strategic and more careful until the person she presented to the world was a perfectly calibrated version of invisible that never caused alarm, or attracted attention, or required anyone to decide what to do with what she could do. I gave 3 years to this palace, she continued. I gave them freely. I gave them before dawn, after dark. On days when I was unwell, and on the anniversary of my expulsion from my village, and on the morning after I heard Lord Fennec's report being discussed in the corridor outside his office and understood what was coming. I gave everything I had to the stone of this building, because my gift compelled it, and because the building needed it, and because... She stopped, and the honesty of the pause was more powerful than any prepared rhetoric could have been, because some part of me believed, against all available evidence, that usefulness was the same as being seen. The council chamber was absolutely still. It is not, and I will not pretend any more that it is. She looked at Lady Voss. You asked what it would take. I will tell you. An Omega Rights Charter, formal, legally binding, entered into the kingdom's founding documents, that requires gifts to be assessed by their outcomes rather than their appearance. That prohibits removal of any palace staff member whose work has structural or operational significance without independent review of that significance. That establishes a formal process for maintenance and operational knowledge to be received, documented, and considered regardless of the rank of its source. She let a beat pass. I want the next girl who presses her hands to a wall to be asked what she hears. Not expelled for. Looking strange. Not called a bad omen. Not filed away in a records room and left there until something falls. She looked at the council. At their faces, the varying registers of discomfort and recognition and the specific expression. That crosses the faces of people who have just understood that they have been complicit in something they did not intend and cannot entirely deny. She looked finally at Fennec. He was not looking back. He was looking at the table in front of him, and she did not know what he was thinking, and she found. Standing in the great hall with the palace's full memory still resonating somewhere deep in her sternum, that she did not need to know. I do not want gratitude, she said quietly, bringing her gaze back to the full council. I want structural change, the kind that outlasts this moment, the kind that means this room, in 30 years, contains voices that would not currently be permitted to speak in it. The council chamber held the silence for a long moment. Then Lord Fennec rose from his chair. His face was composed now, the ash pallor gone, replaced by the particular expression of a man who has made a calculation and decided to act on it regardless of consequence. He opened his mouth to call for the vote of removal that he had been holding in reserve since the beginning of the session. The procedural maneuver that Pembroke had confirmed was within his rights, the last instrument available to him. He raised his hand, and every other hand on the council remained entirely, utterly still. Fennec's raised hand was the only hand in the room. He held it there for 3 seconds, long enough for everyone present to understand exactly what they were witnessing, which was a man discovering in real time the precise dimensions of his own isolation. The gallery above the hall had gone entirely silent. The council members around the table sat with their hands flat on its surface, some of them looking at Fennec, some looking at the table, none of them moving in the direction he had expected. He lowered his hand. His face was composed. He sat. Caelum rose. He did not do it dramatically. He did not push back his chair or draw himself to his full height with the performed authority that the moment might have invited. He simply stood, in the way of a man who has something to say and has decided to say it clearly, without theater. The hall's attention shifted to him with the automatic, collective reflex of a room full of people trained since birth to orient toward alpha authority. He let the attention settle before he spoke. Lord Fenwick. His voice was level, carrying the particular quality of controlled precision that Maren had come to understand was his version of intensity. Not loud, not cold, but deeply and unmistakably serious. Your position on this council was given in good faith. On the basis of expertise, you represented yourself as possessing. The Structural Modernization Initiative was approved on the basis of your team's assessments. Those assessments told us the palace's deterioration was pre-existing, unrelated to any recent change, and addressable through your program's interventions. A pause. The hall was perfectly still. The surveyor's measurement this morning puts 21 inches of verified fracture against your team's claim of pre-existing cosmetic damage. The maintenance logs, 3 years of them, filed in the palace records and never reviewed by your initiative's assessment process, document daily intervention at stress points your team's inspections did not identify. The date correlation between the cessation of that intervention and the onset of measurable structural deterioration is not ambiguous. He looked at Fenwick steadily. Your assessment was wrong, and the recommendation that flowed from that assessment, the expulsion of the person whose work your assessment failed to evaluate, caused direct harm to this palace and to the person who had been maintaining it. Fenwick's expression did not change. He was a man who had learned long ago to wear stillness as armor, and he wore it now, though Maren, watching from the floor, could see the specific quality of the stillness, not calm but contained. The difference between the two was everything. Your council position is revoked, effective today, with formal notation of the basis for revocation entered into the council's permanent record. Caelum did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You are relieved of responsibility for the modernization initiative, which will be suspended pending a full independent structural review. You will cooperate fully with that review. He turned from Fenwick, not dismissively, with the simple finality of a man who has said what needed saying and is moving to what needs doing. He looked at the council, at each face in turn, with the unhurried attention of someone conducting an honest accounting. I signed an expulsion order 3 months ago that I did not read. I did not know the name of the person I was expelling. I did not ask what she did or why she did it or what the palace would be without her. I was given a recommendation by someone I trusted, and I trusted it without examination, and that trust, unexamined, unconditional, extended without any thought for who might be affected by its consequences, was a failure of exactly the kind that the role I hold is supposed to prevent. He paused. The hall waited. The Alpha Council endorses the Omega Rights Charter as presented this morning. I am formally requesting that the Council move to enter it into the Kingdom's founding documents today. As its first order of business following this inquiry's conclusion, the Charter will require gifts to be assessed by outcome. It will prohibit removal of operationally significant staff without independent review. It will establish formal channels for operational knowledge to be received regardless of its source's rank. He turned, finally, to Maren. She was standing on the floor before the central pillar, the same pillar whose fracture had just rewritten the morning, and she was watching him with the particular, careful attention she brought to everything, not warm, not cold, but clear, honest. The look of someone who has decided to see what is actually there rather than what they hoped for or feared. He stepped down from the table's dais, crossed the floor toward her, stopped at a respectful distance, close enough to speak without the hall hearing every word, far enough that the space between them was hers to manage. The council watched. The gallery watched. The great hall held the moment in its ancient stone the way it held everything, without judgment, without preference, with the patient accuracy of something that has been here long enough to understand that moments like this one are what buildings are for. I signed a document I did not read, he said quietly, for her ears only. I dismissed a skill I did not understand. I let someone essential become invisible because I was comfortable in my own blindness. A breath. This ends today. Not because the walls cracked. Because you were always worth more than this. You were worth more than any of this. She held his gaze. She received his words not with forgiveness, Forgiveness was a longer road than a single morning, but with the honest acknowledgement of someone who has been seen, clearly, for the first time. Then the council's vote was called. The charter was entered into the kingdom's founding documents with 11 hands raised, unanimous. The motion recorded in the permanent record with the date and the hour and the name of the person whose testimony had produced it. Maren Ashveil, Palace Maintenance Staff, 3rd Tier. And in the corridor outside the Great Hall, where she found him waiting after the session concluded and the gallery had emptied and the formal business of the morning was complete. He asked her simply, quietly, with no performance attached to it, "What do you need?" She was quiet for a long moment. The palace hummed around her, steady, recognized, held. Then, for the first time in her life, she told someone with the power to respond the complete, unedited truth of what she needed. Not just for the stone, for herself. And he listened, all the way through, without interrupting, without flinching, without looking away. 7 years later, the Ashveil Academy of Gifts occupied the palace's former East Wing. Not because the East Wing had failed, it had not failed, would not fail now. Its foundation as solid as it had ever been in 3 centuries of standing. But because when Maren had been asked, in the corridor outside the Great Hall on the morning after everything changed, what she needed, one of the things she had said was this: "I need there to be a place where the next girl like me does not have to wait 3 years to be asked what she hears." The academy was that place. It was not large, by the standards of great institutions. It did not have the imposing facade of the capital's established colleges or the credentialed weight of the engineering schools that had once been the only buildings in the kingdom where structural knowledge was considered to formally reside. What it had was 14 rooms of varying sizes, 3 senior practitioners who had been found, after a careful, patient search through every village and service hall and overlooked corner of the kingdom, through the new gift assessment protocol that the Omega Rights Charter had established. It had 41 students in its first cohort, Omegas, Betas, and 3 Alphas who had abilities that did not look like power and had therefore spent their lives being managed rather than cultivated. It had a door that opened at 4 in the morning for anyone who needed to work before the rest of the world was watching. Maren had insisted on that last detail. The staff who designed the Academy's operational charter had looked at it uncertainly, this provision about the pre-dawn door, and she had explained it with the patience of someone who understood exactly why it mattered. Because the hours before the world is watching are the hours when the real work happens, and those hours should be honored, not hidden. The Equal Council met in the Great Hall every 3rd week. It was not called the Equal Council. Its formal name was the Integrated Advisory Council of the Realm, but everyone called it the Equal Council. And the name had stuck with the particular durability of names that are simply accurate. Omega, Beta, and Alpha voices in genuinely equal number, with a charter provision prohibiting any single designation from holding more than 1/3 of the seats. The vote that had seemed, to certain members of the original Alpha Council, like a dangerous experiment had produced, in 7 years, the most stable administrative period the kingdom had experienced in a generation. Which was not, Maren had noted in her remarks at the council's 3rd anniversary, a coincidence. It was a demonstration. The same demonstration she had given with a measuring instrument and a stress fracture. Stability came from distributed load. Always. In stone and in governance alike. Caelum sat not at the head of the Great Hall's table, but at its center. This too had been her suggestion, quietly, in the way she still sometimes offered things, not as instructions but as observations, leaving him to arrive at them in his own time and in his own way. A head of table implied a direction of authority. The center implied a point of equilibrium. He had moved his chair on the 4th council meeting and had not moved it back. She sat beside him. Not because protocol required it. The integrated council had its own seating structure, assigned by rotation and committee function, but because the council met on Thursday mornings. And Thursday mornings were when she completed the East Wing's weekly maintenance session. And the East Wing's maintenance session concluded in the Great Hall's antechamber. And the antechamber connected directly to the council chamber. And the seat beside him was where she arrived, naturally, at the beginning of each session. They had not discussed it. It had simply become true. The way the most essential things become true, not through decision but through accumulation. Their daughter was 3 years old. Her name was Senna, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's hands, wide-palmed, long-fingered, with the particular stillness in them that Maren recognized immediately and completely. She had been walking since 11 months, and in the months since she had achieved reliable upright movement, she had developed a habit that the palace's staff had noticed and mentioned to each other in the kitchen and the service halls with the specific tenderness reserved for things that are too meaningful for formal acknowledgement. She pressed her palms to the walls. Not always, not systematically, but often. In the way of a small person still learning the language of the world around her, she would stop in a corridor or a doorway and place both small hands flat against the stone and tilt her head slightly, listening. The stone hummed back. Maren watched her do this one morning in the east corridor, the same corridor where she had spent 3 years working before dawn, where Fennec had found her and called her eccentric, where the first cracks had appeared in the 14 days after she left. Senna's palms were flat on the granite, her head tilted, her expression one of focused and utterly genuine attention. Then she turned to her mother and said, in the clear, direct voice of a child who has not yet learned that truth requires strategic delivery, "It is happy today." Maren crouched to her level, pressed her own palm to the wall beside her daughter's, felt the deep, steady, recognized hum of stone that has been consistently cared for, that knows it is held, that carries its centuries without fear because it has never been left to carry them alone. "Yes," she told her daughter, "it is." The morning light came through the east corridor's window at an angle that turned everything briefly gold. Senna leaned her small head against her mother's shoulder. The palace breathed around them both, patient, ancient, entirely unafraid. The future was not promised. It never was. But it was being built, stone by stone and voice by voice and hand pressed gently to wall, by people who understood that the most essential work often looks like nothing at all, until the day it stops, and the world finally understands what it was holding. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.